and whites together, regardless of where it is in the earth, the whites are at the top and the blacks are at the bottom, even if it's on an African continent.
Sure is. South Africa's a test.
Yeah, even if it's on. And so where does that come from? White supremacy cannot fly unless those who are submitting to it have a belief in it. And so much has been done to hammer into the minds of people, both black and white, that white is superior and black is inferior. Okay? And so when we talk about the European concept, the global plan, we have to mention Charles Darwin. Because Charles Darwin, in his Origin of Species, began to do research and to begin the discussion on the differences and the similarities amongst animals, not humans. And this concept emerges called the survival of the fittest. Okay? How many of you have heard that concept? The survival of the fittest. Now, what does that mean? And noticed in nature that only those animals who were the strongest, who were the most astute, who were the most organized, would survive. And the weakest, even amongst the same species, would eventually die out. They would be preyed upon by others. Okay? Charles Darwin emerges with Origin of Species that talks about that. Well, a few years after him, you have a guy named Herbert Spencer. And I'm putting names up here. I'm an attorney, so I like to name names and so forth, so you can do your own research. Herbert Spencer takes Darwin's theory and creates what is called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism does not apply to animals. Guess what it applies to? Humans. Okay? Darwin does away with God's work in nature. Herbert Spencer's theory does away with God's work with human beings. And now you have the birth of what is called secularism. God is not needed now. And everything that happens because of a natural occurrence of the strongest over the weakest. We understand? And so now, with social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer had a theme for his theory, and it calls might makes right. Now this is important, because we always talk about human rights. We always talk about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's your word right. But in order to get it right, you have to have what? Might. The strongest over the weakest, those who are the mightiest have the right to do what they want to do against those who are perceived to be weaker. So the birth of white supremacy as a social construct has everything to do with what Friedrich Nietzsche said was the death of God. He made a poem, Friedrich Nietzsche. Look him up. God is dead, and we have killed him. Type that into your search engines and see. When God dies, I don't know if you have heard of an author. His name is Basil Davidson. Okay, Basil Davidson. Very courageous European brother. Believed in the prominence and the preeminence of blacks. Very unusual scholar. He wrote a book. He wrote several books. One of them is called African Genius. And in African Genius, he says the European builds big churches, but he never goes. And so, you know, basically what he was saying is that he is responsible for the foundation of what we call religion, but he himself didn't believe it. And a lot of the doctrines that are taught were taught by people who went to churches that nobody went to. They got preeminence because of the war machine that was behind and the political push that was behind what they were pushing. The large cathedrals of Europe today are museums because people stopped going. And Basil Davidson said people never went. They went for weddings, they went for funerals, and pretty much that was it. But what you do have is you have a consistency in the practice and the push for white supremacy. Okay? We haven't even talked about the South yet, have we? We ain't even talked about black folks in Montgomery or anything. But you understand the foundation behind this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Now, how can you defend against this? How can you integrate? This is the question. How can you integrate into something that has as its foundation white supremacy? Now, I have to explain to you really the tenets of it and the foundation of it. I need an eraser, hopefully, if you have one, because I need to put some more things on the board. But as far as your notes go, put in your notes Thomas Jefferson, notes on Virginia. Thomas Jefferson dash notes on Virginia. Because people love to show and people love to talk about how Thomas Jefferson was one of the founding fathers of our country, right? And especially now with all of the Tea Partiers and so forth, these people are making a very serious mistake when they are invoking the names of these people whom allegedly founded this country as being the paradigms of virtue, when in all actuality, when you research what they said, when you research what they said, you will see the exact opposite. Put this phrase in your notes, empty eloquence. Because a lot of what has been passed off to black people as being some things that we should cherish was actually what an African American scholar called empty eloquence. Frederick Douglass said that the exaggerations of the white leaders is purely bombast. Yeah. And so I want to read to you a little bit of what Thomas Jefferson said. Because if one of the founders of American freedom said this, how can we integrate into this creation that he said would never befit black people? Thomas Jefferson himself said this. He says, and this was when the issue during slavery time, notes on Virginia, when the issue of the end of slavery was beginning to emerge. And at the same time, what would be done with black people, the slave, after they would be free? And this is what Thomas Jefferson says. He says, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers? The vacancies they will leave, that was a question. Deep-rooted prejudice, entertained by whites, 10,000 recollections by blacks, of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinction which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one over the other race. Thomas Jefferson said that this thing would never work. Wow. And it would ultimately lead to a race war. He said blacks will remember too much, and whites could not accept the equality that they would begin to demand. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. And I could go even further and talk about some of the other things, but I'm going to leave that as a lesson for you. That's part of your assignment. To read Notes on Virginia and see what Thomas Jefferson said about black people and what he thought.